Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kate Merrick. I'm the director of the School of Information Studies at Dominican University. I would ask you all to mute both your audio and video if it's not already muted. And that will, I think, make for a smoother audio experience for everyone. We have quite a big crowd tonight, which is very exciting. So hopefully the Zoom presentation will go well in our coronavirus replacement with Zoom of our typically face-to-face experience. So welcome to Dominican University's School of Information Studies 2020 Follett Lecture. I see many familiar names on the registration list, from alum to current students to current faculty, staff, and administration, and including friends of the university and of our 2020 Follett Chair, Bernard Riley. I'm gratified to have this opportunity to thank the Follett Corporation for making this lecture tonight possible through their endowment of the Follett Chair. As we get started tonight, I'd also like to thank our Dominican University President, Donna Carroll, for her continued support of this endowment and of the Follett Chair and annual lecture. Beginning with the 2003-2004 academic year, this gift has enabled our School of Information Studies to bring in and to support scholars from all aspects of the information field, from children's and youth services to information policy, to emerging technologies, and to archives and cultural heritage. The common underlying theme and fundamental value of all of our Follett Chair lectures has been the emphasis on the critical nature of information to society in a changing world. Our 2019-2020 Follett Lecture tonight by our chair, Bernard Riley, continues and expands that theme with his lecture entitled Money, Technology, Politics, and the Future of Memory Institutions. Bernard Riley is President Emeritus of the Center for Research Libraries, where he led several major studies and projects focusing on the preservation of digital evidence and documentation, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Corporation, the National Science Foundation, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. From 1987 to 1997, Riley served as the Chief Curator in the Library of Congress, Prints and Photography Division. Bernie has focused more specifically on various aspects of the lecture tonight in his spring lecture series, recordings of which can be found on the Dominican University Follett Lecture website. We are also joined tonight by my colleague, Professor Cecilia Salvatore, coordinator of our School of Information Studies Archives and Cultural Heritage program. With our large group tonight, questions from the chat are not possible, so Cecilia and I will each ask a couple of questions at the end of the lecture. Please also join in the community discussion via Twitter using hashtag Follett Lecture 2020. And now please welcome our 2019-2020 Follett Chair, Bernard Riley.
Okay, thank you, Kate. I assume I'm unmuted now, so if people can't hear me, raise their hands. So I want to thank Kate and the Dominican University for the great privilege of serving as this year's Follett Chair, for the opportunity to pursue research, to teach, and to enjoy the community of the students and faculty at Dominican in the information science, in the information school program. I am deeply grateful. I'm also very grateful to a number of foundations, as Kate mentioned, the MacArthur Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, which all supported some of the research that went into tonight's presentation. Most important is the Center for Research Libraries, who's over 200 US and Canadian and to some extent in foreign university and college research libraries supported the preservation of and continue to support the ongoing preservation of important cultural heritage. and evidence. The residency has been a chance to reflect on my experience in the world of research libraries and museums. As a curator and then director of museum collections and then leader of a library consortium, I had an intimate view of how memory institutions support the formation of consensus among citizens, not only about past events, but also on the realities of the present. The compelling force for me throughout these 40-some years of my career has been a firm belief in the importance of evidence as to a credible public record. I now believe, and this is the bad news, that the fabric of society's memory is actually fraying, if not unraveling. Yikes. In an era when almost no event, however mundane, goes unrecorded, forces are in play that threaten our ability to preserve a credible and enduring record of our times. Libraries, archives, and museums, institutions that have long been entrusted to preserve the digital evidence and documents of contemporary life, today are finding themselves ill-equipped for that, increasingly ill-equipped for that task. Technology has profoundly changed the ways information is produced, maintained, and exchanged, and digital media are inundating the world in oceans of complex data and documentation that challenge traditional museum and library templates for preservation. But there are other forces at work as well. Global finance, for one, the national security state in the wake of 9/11, and the growing secrecy in public life. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that combined, these forces are undermining the mechanisms that Western liberal society has built over the centuries to establish the facts and to establish facts and to ensure the accountability of our largest institutions. Dwarfed by information behemoths like Google, Amazon, and Facebook, and the National Security Agency, even the largest national libraries and archives are ceding stewardship of the record of our times to a handful of private corporations and increasingly authoritarian governments. Absent a fundamental rethinking of our memory institutions, I think we may be sleepwalking towards collective amnesia. The public record and its traditional stewards. Records have been basic to human society since the age of the cave paintings. Diaries and other written observations, news broadcasts, portraits, maps, contracts for the transfer of property and the granting of rights, architectural blueprints have all played a part in everyday life. And with time, these records come to become the raw materials for reconstructing our times, events, and creating a shared understanding of the past. They are the paper trail left by the important actors of our time, by public figures, corporations, government agencies, and ordinary individuals. Newspapers are credited as the first rough draft of history. Even before history is written, though, such evidence is the basis for consensus on important events, essential to the judiciary's ability to establish and contest property claims and facts of matters under consideration. The voluminous documentation gathered and rigorously validated for the Nuremberg trials, for example, now serve as a hedge against plausible denial of horrendous atrocities and of heroic struggle and resistance in that time. The books and newspapers once gathered as intelligence for monarchs, legislators, and policymakers now make up the heritage collections of national libraries. Libraries, archives, and museums are often described as repositories, a term which with its vaguely funereal ring to it, mean places where information and knowledge, otherwise swept along in the constant flow of production, publication, distribution, and consumption, come to rest. Yet they were never really or simply information warehouses. They were actually sites of the deliberative sorting and authentication of evidence. Curators at the Library of Congress had or sought out the expertise on current events required to build collections that could both document the American experience and inform legislative research. The library preserves the photographs taken by Dorothea Lange for the Foreign Security Administration, in which the Foreign Security Administration survey of Depression-era America. These iconic issues, like Dorothea Lange's photograph of a migrant mother in Nipomo, California in 1936, have indelibly shaped our sense of that period, as have Ansel Adams' sympathetic portrayals or portraits of the Japanese Americans interned at Manzanar during World War II. The staff of the Library of Congress's robust overseas operations gathers newspapers, pamphlets, and NGO reports from the streets of Cairo, Nairobi, Islamabad, and other places. This is intelligence that has informs foreign policy as well as scholarship in public policy and political science and affairs. The papers of 13 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court also reside at the Library of Congress, as do the world's largest collection of newspapers. National libraries like the Library like LC and the British Library and Bibliothèque Nationale in France have been able to leverage legal deposit, whereby newspapers to build their near comprehensive domestic holdings. Legal deposit whereby newspapers, books, and music publishers deposited copies of new works in return for copyright protection. National Archives and Public Records offices are by law responsible for preserving the documents and data created in connection with the transaction of public business. In the U.S., NARA, the National Archives and the National Archives and Records Administration archivists actively monitor the vast working files of government agencies, identifying what's relevant to the public interest and therefore worthy of permanent retention. They then provide for the appropriate and systematic disclosure of such records to the general public. Networks of depository libraries like the U.S. Federal Depository Library Program have statutory responsibility in many countries to provide free, ready, and permanent public access to national government information now and for future generations. The over 100 public and university libraries in the Federal Depository Library Program in the U.S. now make the vast amount of information and data produced by U.S. agencies, from congressional record to the Bureau of Labor Statistics to the U.S. Geological Survey and agricultural pamphlets available to citizens. Area and language specialists at the major academic libraries actively seek out and preserve on microfilm documents and other historical evidence from world regions where memory institutions are scarce, untrustworthy, or non-existent. Librarians at Harvard and Cornell reached out to rescue materials at risk of loss through local conflict, censorship, hostile climates, and simple neglect. Their library served as safe havens for files that later incriminated the Khmer Rouge leadership, the perpetrators of the killing fields in Cambodia in the 1970s. They also the transcript of the secret military tribunals in Brazil held in the 1960s and 70s. Transcripts which were copied by an effort led by Harvard University and the Center for Research Libraries, enable the eventual reparations for the survivors and families of those that were killed or disappeared. So, important evidence. Museums collect evidence and preserve artifacts that illumine the past. Some are celebratory and others painful. Architectural drawings and models acquired by the Artists of Chicago and the Canadian Center for Architecture document the evolution of great buildings and structures from concept to blueprint and provide insight into the genesis and materialization of architectural ideas. The Chicago History Museum acquired the uniforms of the Chicago policemen killed in the violence surrounding the Haymarket riots, the Haymarket Affair of 1885. They also collected the transcript. They also hold the transcripts of the trials that unjustly sentenced scapegoated labor leaders to death for that violence. The museum's archives further hold and administer the files of the Chicago Police's notorious subversive activities units, which conducted unlawful surveillance of political dissenters and organizations for decades, ending in 1985. All this work rests on a foundation of sophisticated forensic expertise. In museums, that expertise used to be called connoisseurship. Curators and archivists distinguish fact from fiction on the basis of a knowledge of how documents are produced and used at a given moment in time. They can authenticate an unsigned Lincoln letter by analyzing the handwriting, ink, and paper. They can date a Victorian era photograph from printing out process used. They cultivate the science of provenance as well, interpreting telltale indications of source and chain of custody for an object like the editor's markings on the back of a newspaper morgue photograph. Library and museums also created and maintained the scaffolding that supports historical inquiry. Schema, like the Dewey Decimal System and Library of Congress classification systems, brought order to the vast holdings of the world's libraries. Their published catalogs and disclosures, and their museum published catalogs and disclosure of acquisition and selection policies and priorities make their collections knowable, actually make them well-defined data sets for historians and policymakers that allow peers and readers to independently confirm or contest the narratives of the past. By contrast, the scope of the Google Books universe is unknowable. In effect, the task of archivists and curators has been to define the data set relevant to their communities. They distinguish between what is of enduring interest and what is false, derivative, and ephemeral. They spot the credible sources among the tabloids and the pulps and other detritus of the information market, making those determinations moreover, an inclusive process, and that engages scholars, scientists, researchers, and more recently using social media, the general public at large. The credibility of the bodies of evidence thereby assembled stem ultimately from the accountability of custodial institutions to their communities. Tied to universities and local citizens by the mechanisms of funding and governance, libraries, public archives, and museums are inherently transparent. As the record of contemporary affairs, though, becomes increasingly digital, this magnificent and complex apparatus is now looking cumbersome and quaint. Technology, finance, and certain political forces threaten the underlying premises of memory institutions and suggest that their time as the principal custodians of the public record may be coming to an end. What changed? Three things: technology, money, and politics. Many predicted that the internet would be the demise of libraries and that digital technologies and networks would make information plentiful and ubiquitous and soon render the staid traditional repositories irrelevant. Indeed, memory institutions were inventions of a time when information was scarce, measurable, and came in tangible forms. When records were fixed, when they were carved in stone, written, drawn, or printed in ink on paper, or produced by the exposure of sensitized film or glass to light, sound, or recorded on magnetic tape. Production and distribution then were inherently limited. Documents were discrete objects, artifacts, and self-contained units of content readable by the human eye, or playable on freestanding devices. By contrast, digital technology generates information in forms that are fluid, complex, and infinitely replicable. Facebook and Instagram pages change with each update, and news is a continuous 24/7 stream of content, stream of text, photo, and video content. Digital content could even be dispersed, residing on virtual machines, or lay in pieces on the servers of multiple providers of enabling software and applications, and only assembled on the fly when triggered by a user requests. Library and museum preservation protocols were built around fixed units, though: the photograph, the manuscript, the daily newspaper, the map, and the nightly news broadcast. Legal deposit, too, which was once the powerful engine that built domestic holdings of national libraries like Library of Congress, Bibliothèque Nationale, it rested on the premise that to be copyrighted, works must be in fixed form, discrete packages of content. Aside from complexity and fluidity of content, the sheer volume of content has challenged the memory institutions. The digital media industry unleashes tsunamis of content, online news from countless sources, sensing data generated by a host of handheld devices, satellites, mobile sensors, and police body cameras even. Digital video of world events from on-the-ground observers of the atrocities in Syria, Iraq, and Egypt are plentiful on YouTube. With the immense scale and dizzying pace of digital production, then, libraries and archives are unlikely to capture more than a minute sampling of the primary records of human interaction and government and corporate business. Many hands are being wrung about the loss of digital records or digital works over time through technical flaws like bit rot and format obsolescence. software obsolescence. But the glut of text, image, and video produced each day, however, the greater risk is that important evidence will be buried amidst the trivial and remain irretrievable. For some time, there's been a growing uneasiness about the government's ability to preserve its own digital records. In his widely cited 2010 article, the documentary Big Bang, the Digital Records Revolution and the Future of the Historical Profession, U.S. Department of State historian William McAllister called attention to the explosion in the scope, size, and complexity of diplomatic records being produced by the State Department and its counterparts abroad. Historians, he said, are facing an increase of unprecedented proportions in the fundamental building blocks of our craft. One wonders how GPO's and NARA's orderly processes for preserving and distributing tangible information will handle the masses of data collected in real time by federal agencies. The U.S. Geological Survey's water data for the nation, for instance, economic models developed by the Commerce Department, and the 20 terabytes of environmental data captured each day by NOAA's Big Data project. Much of this evidence requires proprietary software or services, or the services of cloud-based providers to function. In the old days, U.S. Geological Survey's maps could, example, repose intact in library map drawers indefinitely. Now, much of the mapping of local and national utility grids, natural resources, and land use, and even public health data sit on a proprietary platform owned by a private company based in Redwood City, California. NARA's preservation mission was enlarged in 2014 to cover all recorded information, regardless of form or characteristics. That's quoting the Federal Records Act amendment. On the evidence of NARA's digital efforts to date, though, that goal may be chaotic. In 1998, NARA launched an ambitious effort to build a comprehensive system for preserving agency permanent digital records, the Electronic Records Archive. For the task, NARA turned to the defense aviation firm Lockheed Martin. By 2005, the contractor had delivered only a flawed prototype, and a new contract was let to IBM. After an outlay of about $600 million, there's little evidence that the system can render the myriad complex digital records produced by federal agencies today in more than a limited number of formats. As government agencies churn out a flood of electronic records, moreover, the stream of born digital content actually coming into the public domain through the archives remains a mere trickle. National archives in Canada, the UK, and Europe have fared no better. While NARA's ERA was still on the drawing boards, the Congress appropriated another $100 million to the Library of Congress to develop and implement a strategic plan for a National Digital Information Infrastructure and Preservation Program, NDIP. The goal of the program was described in curiously anachronistic terms. It sought ways to, quote, sort, acquire, describe, and preserve electronic materials. Not a good sign. When the NDIP program ended in 2012, there was little to show for the people's investment. The library, like many of its National Library counterparts abroad, plowed much of its new funding into harvesting web content. LC has archived the websites of a lot of congressional offices, US presidential campaigns, and selectively other organizations of interest. Much of this work, however, is outsourced, employing the subscription-based services of a San Francisco-based nonprofit, the Internet Archive. Many of the links in the sites preserved are broken, and multimedia content is often either absent or non-functional. Essentially, scraping content for the surface web, the harvesting engines are largely blocked from the deeper precincts, where more and more information now resides behind paywalls and authentication systems. As the architecture of the web continues to evolve, the limitations of the harvesting technology most likely will increase. Capturing the rapidly changing dynamic content of online news, in particular, the digital rough draft of history, so to speak, has also proved particularly difficult for national libraries. Today, a quarter of a century after the New York Times launched its online edition, legal deposit at most national libraries can accommodate only the static page image files of newspaper print editions. Copyright restrictions, in fact, prevent even the national libraries from making much of what they do archive accessible beyond their physical premises. In 2010, the Library of Congress announced its intention to create a comprehensive archive of Twitter content. It walked back that claim 7 years later. Quote, sort, acquire, describe, and preserve electronic materials. Abraham Maslow, in his Psychology of Science in 1966, said, I suppose it is tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. In the early 2000s, the GPO, the Government Publishing Office, launched a similarly flawed effort to develop a virtual successor to the Federal Depository Library Program. The Federal Digital System, or FedSys, later rechristened info.gov, was to provide free online access to official publications from all three branches of government and guarantee long-term preservation access to government content, to digital government content. In 2018, some $57 million later, most federal agencies surveyed by the Federal Research Division of the Library of Congress admitted having no systematic effort in place to provide GPO's electronic repository of record, the publications or documents their agencies produce. Technology has complicated life in museums as well. Despite expressed intentions to collect born digital materials and some impressive achievements deploying digital media for purposes of audience outreach and public programming, not even the largest institutions seem to have the necessary means or resources to deal with vast and technologically complex digital works. In 2004, the Art Institute of Chicago had to walk away from its bid to acquire the archives of the Distinguished Architectural Office, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. The Art Institute owns many of the early Skidmore, Owings and Merrill presentation drawings and models, but found that since the 1970s, the major studios, or the studio had embraced computer-aided design, three-dimensional modeling, and had amassed virtual modeling, and had amassed terabytes of structured engineering and construction data. The technical demands of developing and maintaining systems to accept and independently maintain those formats were judged by the Institute to be prohibitive. Memory institutions are stymied not only by the amount and complexity of digital information, but by user expectations as well. Sophisticated search and digitization and visualization applications are now indispensable in fields like public policy, the social sciences, and even the humanities, to enable researchers to make sense of vast bodies of available text, image, and data, to discern the signal amidst the noise, to detect political trends and ideological networks, and even to predict the emergence of conflicts and epidemics. The 25 million books Google digitized are all from the holdings of great public and university libraries, but the powerful text mining and visualization tools Google provides are eroding the value of those original collections for researchers, even historians, who find the Google corpus more navigable. When the tools make life easier for researchers, there follows a downward spiral of diminishing demand and therefore declining investment. True, the radical scaling up of the universe of useful information is something that memory institutions have encountered and dealt with in the past. The advent of printing in the medieval West, for instance, photography in the 1840s, and home movies and videos in the mid-20th century all dramatically expanded the size of the information cosmos. In each case, libraries adapted, but I think this time is different. The problem is not the evolution of technology so much, and this time the corporate sector has plunged into the information business with a vengeance. In the last 30 years, the financial industry has become a major driver of information technology. Michael Bloomberg's spectacular success in building an empire of diverse media properties, from Business Week magazine to a 24-hour cable broadcasting network atop a relatively simple data terminal, is testament to the wholesale monetization of information in the digital era. Wall Street today is a major consumer, not only of financial data, but of news, climate data, and population and trade statistics. In the 1990s, computer engineers at US hedge funds, in fact, began to devise ways to extract actionable information from years and even decades worth of electronic text, which they source directly from Associated Press, Reuters, and Agence France-Presse and other agencies. Banks and investment firms now routinely employ sophisticated algorithms and tools to model prices, earnings, and risks, and to predict stock performance and other complex and dynamic phenomena, often in real time. Money is an accelerant. In the world of global finance, the value of information is tied to the speed at which it is delivered. Computerized decision-making, computerized decision-making in the hyper-competitive financial markets occurs in ever smaller fractions of nanoseconds. By contrast, traditional information brokers operate at a snail's pace. Throughout the Cold War, the Library of Congress Federal Research Division's country reports provided business and military interests reliable intelligence on the economic and political climates of developing nations abroad. The library's overseas operations gathered newspapers and gray literature from NGOs on the ground in Latin America, East Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. That net was enlarged through microformatting arrangements with newspaper publishers in Eastern Europe, East and Central Asia, and the Soviet Union that supplied academic libraries. That supply chain has been supplemented today by faster moving private sector actors like the Economist Intelligence Unit and Thomson Reuters that provide business and political intelligence almost in real time. Yet complexity and speed create public hazards. While libraries and public archives are eminently auditable, the world of financial and eminently transparent, the world of financial information is opaque. Information on the sourcing of data by commercial data organizations is either highly fluid or a well-kept trade secret. There is no accounting of what data exists, for example, in commercial databases like LexisNexis. The downside of this opacity became dramatically apparent after the 2008 financial meltdown, when it was necessary to unwind the complex investment products in which banks and investment houses had been trading for years. At the root of the crisis, according to the economist Fernando de Soto, was the deterioration of public memory systems. Fernando de Soto said, over the past 20 years, the very systems that could have provided markets and governments with the means to understand the global financial crisis and to prevent another one are being eroded. Governments have allowed shadow markets to develop and reach a size beyond comprehension. Mortgages have been granted and recorded with such inattention that homeowners and banks often don't know and can't prove who owns their homes. In a few short decades, the West undercut 150 years of legal reforms that made a global economy possible. With globalized supply chains, information vital to public interest is being commodified on an unprecedented scale, even beyond Wall Street. Since the 1990s, the federal government is no longer the dominant producer, for instance, of geospatial information. The deregulation of outer space in the 1990s enabled the entry of commercial satellite companies, dozens of commercial satellite companies, into the Earth imaging arena. Commercial satellites in orbit, commercial satellites in orbit now outnumber government-operated ones. The U.S. Air Force now buys remote sensing data from private companies like Airbus and Digital Globe. Digital Globe imagery, which you see on the screen now, has become essential to monitoring North Korea's nuclear testing activity. This photo from Digital Globe last year of the North Korean nuclear site at Punggye-ri, the nuclear test site. These data is also, the satellite data has also become important to Amnesty International's tracking of the damage inflicted by Russian and US-led coalition strikes in airstrikes in Syria. At the same time, the ocean floor is being mapped by the vast seismological sensing operations of energy companies like ExxonMobil, BP, and Royal Dutch Shell. How much of that data, you have to wonder, would have been useful in the prevention, investigation, and or publicly funded cleanup of disasters like the Deepwater Horizon? At ground level, big agri. The Canadian scholar Irene Nezovic has shown how the era of the smart farm and decision agriculture, farm equipment, seed, and chemical corporations like John Deere, Syngenta, and Bayer are now brokers of vital information on soil quality, crop yields, water supply, and the environment. Software applications downloaded to tablet devices and sensors on tractors and other farm equipment capture and transmit a constant flow of microdata from the field back to the corporate cloud in real time. In return, the big agri-firms provide farmers for a price predictive analytical services to inform farm management decisions. This flow of information, though, is a closed circuit. Like bank data about investment products, the farm data could be useful for understanding threats to the larger environment, the effects of insecticides on pollinating insects, for example, where its use not governed by highly restricted licenses. Unlike memory institutions, corporations consider data competitive intelligence and therefore core enterprise assets. Although potentially valuable for policy making on the environment, climate, and food supply, the data instead becomes a closely held corporate asset. Artificial intelligence and other computer-aided techniques for mining large aggregations of text and statistical data have made information newly valuable to industry and commerce, increasing the likelihood that the producers will continue to hoard this data for their own purposes, knowledge that in the past would have been retired to the National Agricultural Library or the Library of Land-Grant University. What Google Books did for the great research libraries, corporate data aggregators are doing for the public information apparatus. As GPO struggles to gather the digital products of federal agencies into its federal depository, its virtual federal depository, commercial aggregators take advantage of the oceans of government data the agencies are porting directly to the web. Enigma Technologies, LLC, harvests international shipping manifest information posted by the Commerce Department. Enigma then deploys artificial intelligence-driven analytic and visualization capabilities to extract actionable information from that data for corporate planners. The well-meaning Open Government Data Initiative of the Obama administration has given rise to corporate welfare in the information industry, to another form of corporate welfare in the information industry. Much of the data gathered by government agencies themselves and many of the official agent records of those agencies reside today on the servers of private sector contractors. Amazon's government cloud is the leading infrastructure as a service solution for storage of electronic records, including records of the CIA, National Security Agency, and as many of a third of UK government agencies. Amazon offers not only safekeeping of records, but a suite of software applications and tools that public servants can use to organize, retrieve, and analyze their records and data. While this digital content is ostensibly government-owned, it is useless without the tools and analytical applications, also proprietary, that are needed to navigate and make sense of it. It is hard to imagine those records eventually migrating to NARA and the UK National Archives in any usable fashion. Commercial curatorship can undermine evidentiary value as well. YouTube routinely strips potentially useful metadata from posted videos, timestamping and geolocation, for instance, relevant to the credibility of those videos as evidence. And inherent in social media platforms like Facebook, we now know, is the potential for undetectable selection bias. The slow uncovering of the dynamic behind the flood of Russian disinformation on Facebook during the 2016 US presidential election made evident what a black box that platform is. The complexity and secrecy of what the British economist Paul Mason has called the walled garden of proprietary technology makes it difficult to establish the facts or even to define the scope of an enormously consequential and constantly changing data set. Stewardship of peer-reviewed scientific and scholarly literature, once one of the core purposes of academic libraries, is also largely outsourced now. Most of the ebooks, journals, and databases scholars use reside on the servers of commercial publishing giants like Reed Elsevier and Axel Springer. Although the subscription costs consume the lion's share of library budgets, libraries no longer actually own these materials. Publishers reserve the right to withdraw content at their discretion. Major libraries are reduced to haggling with publishers over annual subscription price increases, while the playing field in the world of research libraries of research steadily tilts in favor of the commercial sector. Awareness of the situation is beginning to dawn on the scholarly community. A 2018 Social Science Research Council report to secure knowledge, social science partnerships for the common good, raised the alarm. The report said, quote, several decades ago, much of the world's social science data was generated by universities, government agencies, or international organizations. Today, information technologies have caused an exponential increase in the quantity of socially relevant data, much of which has become the intellectual property of companies. Most dramatically, private industry has destabilized the social knowledge system. Today's companies own exabytes of social data, and many also control the tools to gather and analyze that data. As a consequence, private sector norms of flexibility, efficiency, and profitability take their place alongside traditional scholarly ones of reliability, critical scrutiny, and openness, unquote. Museums also have ceded ownership of the raw materials of history as well. Tangible collection artifacts no longer bear as much of the onus of their storytelling as they did in the past. Dramatic advances in flat screen display technologies and computer-assisted computer-driven video enable exhibition departments to draw from an enlarged universe of content. While this has been liberating because the digital evidence resides outside their walls, museums have become dependent upon photo agencies like Getty Images and broadcasters like CNN, broadcasters with large video libraries like CNN, and on media platforms and cloud services like Facebook and YouTube for hosting and curation of their content. The Obama Foundation recently made the novel decision not to assume custody of the administration's papers for the Presidential Center's museum. Preserving the social media content generated by America's first African-American president is now a matter to be negotiated, not between the National Archives and the White House, but between the Obama Center's curators and Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Less collecting, more licensing. In the words of the eminent economist Joseph Stiglitz, the private provision of public good is essentially never optimal. Next, politics. In the fall of 2016, after the election of Donald Trump, a panic suddenly arose among American environmentalists and climate scientists. Their fear was that the incoming administration, beholden to fossil fuels interests, might move surreptitiously to suppress the climate data gathered under previous administrations by the EPA, NOAA, and other scientific agencies. Concerned that crucial evidence could disappear from agency websites set off a scramble to rescue the posted data sets and archive them independently. A volunteer army of scientists, librarians, and ordinary citizens mobilized to download much of the relevant data for rehosting and safekeeping on non-government servers. The alarm proved to be false. The data is still there. But amidst the efforts, it was interesting to note that the institutions entrusted with the long-term security of government information, National Archives and Records Administration and the Government Publishing Office, stood on the sidelines of the effort with little to contribute. The fraught politics of the new century have begun to warp the information ecosystem in ways that threaten the integrity of the public record. Electronic surveillance in the name of national security, heightened secrecy of public figures, and in a bitterly partisan political climate, and the growing influence of authoritarian regimes all seem to be helping fence off information that is vital to civil society. A series of articles in the Washington Post on Top Secret America in 2011 documented how the U.S. intelligence and counterterrorism industry expanded in the wake of 9/11, growing far beyond the CIA, FBI, and others in the government sector to accomplish a vast network of private companies. Armed with sensing technologies of unimaginable sensitivity and exploiting consolidation in the telecommunications industry and dramatic advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning, companies and government agencies now collect and control data on individual citizens on an unprecedented scale. Use of body cams, CCTV, and dash cam videos by law enforcement groups is commonplace worldwide. Biometric data such as DNA, fingerprints, and iris scans are becoming ever more valuable and intrusive instruments of state control. Harvard philosopher Peter Gallison observed on the ubiquity of of surveillance. Oops. The fabric of urban life, commercial interactions, policing, and justice are all part of our archived and mined world today, unquote. Unfortunately, many of the largest archives, the vast repositories of data collected, are in the private sector. The leading repository of video generated by police body cam and dash cam devices is operated by Palantir Technologies, a privately held and famously secretive company co-founded by conservative investor Peter Thiel. Aside from hosting video for over 1,000 local and state police departments, Palantir provides artificial intelligence-enabled analytic applications like face and voice recognition to the Department of Homeland Security and other law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The application enables the mapping of family and personal relationships of terrorism suspects, and when used in tandem with real-time video, can identify and locate the movements of and can identify and locate illegal immigrants. WNYC in New York reported that ICE agents used the company's apps in the field during workplace raids. The security data applications interact with vast public information databases of mugshots and DMV photographs, for example. The facial analysis and identification used by the FBI in over 600 police departments draws also from millions of photographs harvested by software provider Clearview Artificial Intelligence from Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and other social media sites. The problem is that commercial repositories observe few of the protocols that traditionally have ensured the appropriate disclosure of public records. They're often exempt from compliance with FOIA requests, for instance. Moreover, whether state and local public records office or even national archives will ever have the wherewithal to assume custody of their data, of this kind of data, or to maintain the sophisticated software that makes them useful for the long run is an open question. Meanwhile, they remain in black boxes. They're built in flaws. These repositories remain black boxes. They're built in flaws and biases or being impossible to detect. This corporate gold rush for personal data threatens to taint academia's knowledge base as well. Reed Elsevier, one of the companies to which universities have entrusted collecting and delivery of news and scientific and scholarly information publishing, has an investment stake in Palantir, in fact. And Palantir's CEO is on Axel Springer's shareholder committee. In 2015, Reed Elsevier acquired a cybersecurity startup specializing in tracking the online activities of individuals. The Intercept recently reported that Thomson Reuters, parent of the legal publishing giant Westlaw, won contracts over $54 million in value to provide surveillance data analysis services to ICE. Ergo, the paradox of universities and law schools providing a window into student and faculty research activities to publishers aggressively investing in surveillance technologies. Yikes. Among the largest players in the snooping industry are two Chinese firms, Megvii in face recognition and iFlyTech in voice recognition. In 2019, the US Department of Commerce blacklisted both of the companies, citing their involvement in human rights violations against Uyghurs and other members of Muslim minority groups in Xinjiang. One can imagine the growing economic influence of China and other illiberal regimes that seek to rewrite history and erase memory of certain events, imposing their repressive norms on the global information scene, as the US and Europe abandoned global leadership there. We saw signs of this in 2017, when the Cambridge University Press temporarily bowed to pressure from the Chinese government censors to block access to journal articles on the subject of the Cultural Revolution and Tiananmen Square. In the past, libraries at US and European universities have been safe havens for sensitive evidence, like the Khmer Rouge files that I mentioned earlier, and also Mexican government records, records of Mexican government intelligence agencies. To what extent will American universities remain willing to preserve and expose evidence of Beijing's persecution of minorities, for example, when Chinese tycoons are major donors and Chinese students are a reliable source of tuition revenue? The tsunami of money flooding into American politics in the wake of the 2010 Citizens United decision has subsidized the indiscriminate gathering of data on citizens and households in the service of winner-take-all partisan politics as well. Exposure of Cambridge Analytica's mining of the personal information of over 87 million Facebook users and their friends show the degree to which social media platforms have become the go-to sources for demographic data. These dark pools of data collected by the platforms represent an unprecedented concentration of data on the opinions, spending, family relationships, and even the voting records of citizens. Concentration in the hands not of public agencies like the Census Bureau or the Department of Labor, but of Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Twitter. In the future, scholars and investigators could find themselves dependent entirely on corporate sources for data essential to governance and policymaking. And then the robust public knowledge base we've long taken for granted might well wither away. George Washington University's Henry Farrell on a CSSRC blog recently outlined one scenario. Farrell said, as scholars begin to look to private businesses for data, the contours of entire academic fields may become subject to pervasive forms of selection bias. As certain research topics and methods are favored while others fall by the wayside. It's highly unlikely, for example, that Facebook will ever allow its proprietary data to be used for public research on the role that it played in facilitating upheavals during the Arab Spring, unquote. Move to another slide. Oops, sorry. The privatization of what has been until now public information has another downside. It defeats the mechanisms put in place by liberal democratic governments to disclose evidence even of their own covert activities. The complicity of British colonial officials in the torture and assassination of Mau Mau activists in Uganda, the subversive activities of the Chicago Police Red Squad, and the Stasi surveillance of citizens in East Germany during the Cold War eventually came to light because protocols existed to trigger their release. Those mechanisms were never designed for an age where the responsibility for official records is outsourced. In the US, NARA and GPO have functioned for a long time as instruments of transparency. NARA disclosed to the public in due course, historical materials that are at one time highly sensitive and threatening to certain vested interests. The Nixon Watergate tapes, for example, the records of FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr., and CIA files on covert operations in Cuba, Iran, and Latin America. The Scholarly Advisory Committee oversees the orderly declassification and disclosure and release over time of even top secret State Department communications. However, NARA's ability to detect, let alone prevent the disposal or the destruction of key electronic records today is limited. A Federal Research Division study found that as recently as of 2018, few federal agencies followed NARA's guidelines on digital records and records management, or were even familiar with their responsibilities to make their digital publications and data available to the GPO. NARA lacked the authority, for instance, to prevent outgoing Bush administration staff from deleting millions of White House emails in 2008, to prevent Hillary Clinton from using a personal email server to circumvent State Department records policies, or to prevent the CIA from destroying the video recordings of its interrogations of terrorist suspects after 9/11. It took Edward Snowden, a private contractor's employee, to reveal the collected all policy of an unrestrained national security agency. So it's hard to imagine NARA assuming custody of over 2 decades worth of surveillance information that NSA holds now in its data centers, which dwarf the facilities NARA operates to hold over 2.5 centuries of government records. In his September 2018 essay on state secrecy, archival negligence, and the end of history as we know it, Columbia University historian Matthew Connolly cites a generation of government officials who not only insist on working in secrecy, but also fail to protect or even destroy the record of their actions, as undermining the system of laws and institutions created to organize and preserve official records. Connolly said, while politicians will continue to appeal to history when convenient, they have so neglected the National Archives and so failed to control official secrecy that future historians will have a hard time providing anything at all. Proving anything at all. We will not be fully aware of what is being lost for decades to come, if ever. Sorry, one slide behind. Fortunately, a new generation of stewards are making up for the limitations of traditional memory institutions. Small, media-savvy teams of organizations unearth, authenticate, and expose government and corporate records of human rights violations, state-sponsored violence, official corruption, and environmental crime. WikiLeaks, for all its faults, created the template for this kind of work in 2007 when it posted to the web classified U.S. Army manual for soldiers dealing with the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. Aside from WikiLeaks, the most widely known is the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which has breached the proprietary walls of secrecy of banks, corporations, and law firms. In 2016, the ICIJ exposed data online from over 11 million pages of leaked legal and financial documents known as the Panama Papers. Other groups gather, curate, and expose on the web a wealth of video, photographic, and statistical information from citizen journalists and open sources. The Violations Documentation Center in Syria, for example, established in 2011, engages in the scrupulous and independent documentation and curation of information on human rights violations during the Syrian conflict. The Documentation Center is a resource for traditional media, but also for all future accountability and justice-related procedures for Syria. Here in Chicago, the Invisible Institute, a journalism cooperative, supports the Citizens Police Data Project, which collects and analyzes police department records and public notices to establish patterns of abuse like illegal searches, unjustified use of force, etc. Historically, memory institutions provided a bulwark against secrecy, censorship, disinformation, and other efforts by dictators and extremists to undermine trust in the public record. As the national security corporate nexus gears up its information mill, though, and public sector retrenchment continues, that bulwark is eroding. Cuts in university and government funding of libraries and archives, squandered investment, and the gradual attrition of curatorial expertise have put the public interest on the losing side of a technology arms race with the corporate world and the national security state. There we go, Syria Documentation Center. Now what? Obviously, libraries and museums will always have a role in promoting an evidence-based understanding of the present and the past. It'll always be necessary to collect and preserve tangible evidence. Museums and libraries will usefully carry on with the digitization of historical artifacts and collections. The recent developments have exposed the limitations of the custodial model. If we see the principal challenge to that model as NARA did, as the volume, variety, and technical complexity of electronic records, and the role of libraries, archives, and museums, as the Library of Congress did in 2000, to, quote, sort, acquire, describe, and preserve, unquote, will be like Maslow's man with a hammer. The rules of the information game will be written in the realms of finance and politics, and what is at risk is an enduring fact-based public record and a credible shared public memory. It's probably time to recognize the terms digital curation and web archiving for the oxymorons that they are, and radically to reconceptualize the nature of our work. How do we reconceptualize the nature of our work? First, 4 ways, 4 possibilities. Triage. Decide what's most important and most endangered. Libraries and museums are by definition selective. Curators are discerning. In a world where data is superabundant, it's harder than ever to separate signal from noise. Because the threats to the survival of digital evidence are many and varied, technical obsolescence, government suppression, and malicious activity, curators should choose their battles. Focus on they should focus their efforts on evidence that is credible, of high value to constituents, and unlikely to survive absent their interventions. It's a waste of public resources to archive digital news from CNN, the New York Times, and other organizations that are in a far better position to archive, to maintain their own content. Threat mapping, the ability to identify and characterize risks and to catalog losses, becomes an essential curatorial skill. The archives community is beginning to grapple with the thorny issues of non-custodial preservation. In the areas of human rights, for example, Swiss Peace at the University of Basel is modeling ways of ceding curatorial authority and control over evidence to stakeholder communities like the colectivos in Mexico that represent the families of those who disappeared during the drug wars. The many local and international archivist organizations that gather data and documentation as a means to political and humanitarian ends struggle for financial viability. They deserve not our intervention, but our support. Second, audit. Inscribed on the facade of the Boston Public Library's Central Library building in Copley Square is a succinct expression of memory institution accountability. Quote, the public library of the city of Boston, built by the people and dedicated to the advancement of learning. Unquote. Libraries, archives, and museums are born of communities. When curation of public knowledge shifts from the institutions answerable to the people of the cities, nations, and universities that built them to the private sector and the national security state, public good inevitably gives way to stockholder interests and the agendas of the powerful. To ensure that the new stewards serve the community's interests, immediate and long-term, what data they're collecting, how they're sourcing and managing that data should be matters of public record. Now that social media platforms are de facto public infrastructure, attention must be paid to things like how do video content and metadata change when uploaded and processed through the YouTube platform. What inherent biases exist in Facebook algorithms that determine what appears in one's news feed? And most important, when and under what circumstances the dominant social media platforms remove and censor posts. Witness.org, for example, has identified the limitations of proprietary applications like WhatsApp used to capture and store evidence of police violence, and has identified norms and practices for preserving and protecting many kinds of electronic evidence. Efforts at universities like Georgetown University's Perpetual Lineup Project at the Law School Center on Privacy and Technology their study of police facial recognition tech use has been very useful. None of these projects, though, are taking place in the libraries. Why not? Curators should be able to also to follow the money, to identify the sources of funding and influence that drive the agendas of major actors in the news media, exposing the silent partners, such as the third-party providers like Palantir, of critical applications and services upon which public interest data relies. Exposing the silent partners is key to distinguishing credible evidence-based news sources from alternative facts, separating the signal from the noise. Third, invest. I've fallen a couple of slides behind. Okay. As the information world's center of gravity shifted to the private sector, universities and federal funders failed to invest wisely and strategically and adequately in digital capabilities. As national libraries, archives, and universities poured hundreds of millions in public funds into web archiving, format registries, and other anachronistic preservation solutions, media organizations like Bloomberg and the New York Times, and NGOs like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists built robust capabilities to effectively curate and host vital public interest documentation at scale. Universities, at least for the time being though, still account for considerable spending in the information market. The power of the purse used strategically could purchase influence, albeit limited, on the practice of the largest and most credible information providers. Newspapers have always been the primary sources for scholars in a wide range of academic disciplines. The academic world stands by as the business model for news reporting is collapsing. collective negotiations on national site licenses for the most essential and comprehensive news sources like the New York Times, Bloomberg, El País, and others might provide funding to those organizations to replace the disappearing advertising revenue that has been the lifeblood of the organizations in the past. Investment at a meaningful scale could even mitigate the warping effects of the advertising business model of what matters are reported. As right and left-wing conspiracy mongering news sources like Fox News and Breitbart increase their claim on public attention, and autocratic powers like China and Russia lay siege to unbiased journalism, identifying, supporting the credible sources will produce a more evidence-based first draft of history. Fourth, act up. As stewardship of the public record passes, from memory institutions to the corporate world, it is simply too important not to regulate. Just as the federal government once established the responsibilities of national memory institutions like NARA and the Library of Congress through statutes, the curatorial profession should demand that regulatory power be brought to bear on the new challenges in this arena. NARA should have greater statutory authority to intervene early in the life cycle of government records to ensure that the systems government agencies employ to create and maintain critical records and data are future-proof. Empowered with greater oversight over agency IT contracting, for example, and working in tandem with, in league with agency inspectors general, NARA might steer the fast-moving train of government technology IT adoption instead of running behind that train. As it pursues its data at rest strategy, whereby agencies maintain their historical records permanently, NARA should have the authority to set the terms with providers of cloud services and to enforce the use of well-documented record formats and standards. Fewer government record systems then would be black boxes. The Federal Depository Library Program needs conceptualizing as well. Originally designed to overcome two historical barriers to access, cost and distance, the depository system has outlived its usefulness when most government agencies publish directly to the web. When universities and local public library systems already bear most of the cost of depository libraries, they have the power to restructure the program as a watchdog network independent of the DPO and to deploy the legions of document librarians nationwide in monitoring production and dissemination of government information. Ensuring that government agencies meet the people's needs, including affordability, could result in fewer walled gardens and expensive proprietary tools. Providing this kind of daylight would be in line with the Federal Depository Library's original purpose of maintaining the currently incomplete and redundant government docs repositories. One can even imagine national libraries using legal deposit as a lever to mitigate monopolistic practices in the information world. Copyright was established to protect the exclusive right of authors and inventors to benefit from their works of authorship. Yet its ultimate purpose, at least in the US, was to promote the progress of the useful arts and sciences. Unfortunately, copyright protection can hamper understanding of how software essential to the public interest works. It has been wielded to obscure the faults and biases in applications used in criminal sentencing and congressional redistricting, for example, and even voting machine operating systems. These applications certainly deserve greater public scrutiny. Perhaps the Register of Copyright and maybe government contracting agencies should have the authority to demand the escrow and/or independent auditing of the proprietary code for applications of demonstrable impact on legal affairs. In conclusion, we can't roll back the changes created by the large and irresistible forces now in play, but we can reverse the trend toward a diminished public knowledge base. If libraries, archives, and museums are to play a role in shaping and preserving society's memory, change must begin with their parent institutions, governments and universities. Back in the 1970s, when electronic publishers began to divert the river of knowledge that historically flowed to users through libraries, the public sector and academia essentially acquiesced. Governments have allowed the institutions they created for stewardship of public information to languish. if academia is to continue to be a locus for the disinterested interpretation of the past and the production of new knowledge, universities must invest aggressively in new capabilities and new partnerships. If we want transparency and accountability in government, we must, as a profession, acknowledge and engage with the NGOs, media organizations, platform providers, and other natural allies to create, manage, and distribute trustworthy information. Again, Peter Gallison. The classified universe is, at best I can estimate, on the order of 5 to 10 times larger than the open literature that finds its way to our libraries. We in the open world who study the world lodged in our libraries are living in a modest information booth, facing outward, with our unseeing backs to a vast and classified empire we barely know. Absent prompt, decisive action, unquote, absent prompt, decisive action, the integrity of the public record will continue to be compromised, and our collective memory will be shaped by forces and interests that we neither understand nor control. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. That was really, really fascinating and quite disturbing. But as always like to see what the solutions are that you offer. And so I was really intrigued by the 4 points that you made at the end of your lecture. And before I ask just one quick question about that, and then let's see what Cecilia has to ask, I just wanted to make one comment also, that I'm struck by the theme that not only is our past and our memories shaped by what is preserved and accessible, but also the future, because that impacts attitudes and policy so deeply. So it's not just about the memory, it's about what we create for the future. So really, really interesting and fascinating comments about that. So your 4 points at the end in terms of what's next. Let me see if I can get to my notes on that. So first of all, triage, really interesting. And I was really fascinated about the term threat mapping within triage. So I'd like to maybe talk to you another time about that. Then audit, invest, and act up. So I want to just zero in really quickly on the concept of investing. So taking universities as a key example, how would we invest?
The major lever that universities have is, well, a lot of the capability for managing content and documentation and evidence has been developed outside of universities in the corporate sector, in the financial sector, in the national security sector. So partnerships, there will be the need to engage with those communities to serve the purposes of public interest and historical memory. The lever that universities have is sharing of resources and to some extent funding. I mean, the licensing model has become pervasive, almost pervasive in the university toolbox for toolkit for supporting scholarship and research. Engaging these larger organizations with these enormous and robust capabilities can happen through partnerships like licensing, partnerships like the negotiation of terms for the terms of access for use of of that content, and also for insights into how those big repositories work. So I think partnership is something that libraries and archives have been very good at historically, and so the investment that's called for, that I think is called for, is going to be an exchange not only of money through the licensing mode, but money paired with expertise, resources, and attention. So that's
yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Cecilia, you have a question?
Yeah, I actually have a couple, but let me start. You mentioned, you know, in praise of libraries, archives, and museums, you mentioned the deliberative sorting and authentication of information and evidence that libraries, archives, and museums have done. And yet, there has been criticism, especially of archives and museums, for relying too much on so-called experts in the field and ignoring maybe the voice of the marginalized. And the result of that is the growth of community archiving. And so, for example, when you see the Occupy Wall Street, for example, when that happened, it was, you know, the work of community archivists, the women's movement, for example, the Women's March. It's all the work of archivists sort of rising up really to, and sort of taking over perhaps what NARA or other, you know, bigger institutions should be doing. So I guess my question to you then is, where do you see the work of these community archivists, and what kind of impact will they make in this whole discourse?
CRL has been working with a number of community archive or communities in preserve the documentation of the some of the violence that happened during the drug wars, the disappearances. I think I'm muted for some reason. Oh, you're okay. I got it. That's involved really essentially looking to them for the expertise on what ought to be preserved and on the terms under which it should be preserved and the terms under which it should be made available. A number of universities have done the same thing. University of Texas at Austin, for instance, has really modeled what they call post-custodial archiving, which instead of going in the old model of preservation of materials from developing parts of the world, was to go there and microfilm the documentation and then come back and leave a copy of the microfilm. Texas has been, the Benson Center at Texas, working in Latin America, has been working with a lot of organizations there that to preserve documentation without actually collecting that documentation. So that involves support for building local capabilities and that kind of thing. So I think this part of the acknowledgement of that collecting or preservation is not necessarily collecting as it used to be, or collecting is not an essential step in preservation anymore. That you surrender a certain amount of authority and a certain amount of control to the organizations that are in a better position to preserve the documentation, whether that be a colectivo in Mexico or the New York Times, which has its own ways of preserving content. I didn't mention when Kate asked about the investing, and I did bring up licensing, which sounds like a crass thing, but the Center for Research Libraries actually negotiated with the New York Times the academic site license, the National Academic Site License for the New York Times Online, when we realized at the Center, CRL realized that so much New York Times content was being put on the web and not being captured by the ProQuest product that libraries buy, and that all this content was leaking away. The way we found to engage the New York Times in discussion about how to preserve that content, the born digital content, was we got their attention through saying, we have a lot of libraries are interested in the potential of supporting your activity in the form of subscription to the online content. And we could bring them together, but you're going to need to make some concessions. And what happened, we don't take credit, CRL, we didn't take credit for it at CRL at the time, but since that site license was negotiated, the New York Times earns $3 million a year through CRL from academic libraries. And we'd like to think that that money goes into reporting from South Sudan and from Myanmar and places like that. And at the same time, the New York Times also, since we negotiated that site license, posted on the web in their online repository every article they published since they were founded in 1851. So sorry, I hope I didn't give short shrift to the community archiving part of it.
No, that's okay. You said that corporate entities have sort of taken over with a vengeance, was the word you used. Where do you see corporate archivists and librarians sort of helping to make sense of this whole process then?
They can be real agents of transparency. If it puts them in a real awkward position, though. I mean, if data is money to a company, the idea of disclosure is just usually a non-starter. It depends on what the role is in the corporate hierarchy. In many cases, it's not very high. We've working with a Reynolds School of Journalism at the University of Missouri and the libraries there. We've been doing interviews in newsrooms around in different parts of the country, and it's interesting to see where the newspaper's morgue or where the newspaper's librarian fits in the hierarchy. In some cases, they're very low down. In other cases, they're much higher at the policy level.
So Bernie, I'll ask another quick question, and then we might take one more, and I think then we'll have to close the lecture. My question is, I've heard you refer to citizen journalists, and I'm interested to hear you maybe give an example of that or talk a little bit more about the unusual contributions that we've seen from grassroots organizations.
Yeah, the citizen journalists, the people like in the field, like capturing things on video and on audio and on photographs. That's been extremely important. Some of them are working in the context of journalism collectives or journalism cooperatives, and but the people that are actually citizens more than journalists, but contributing social media content or contributing content from social media, like videos from Tahrir Square in Egypt, in Cairo during the Arab Spring and things like that. They're the eyes on the ground. The challenge, though, is to authenticate what they generate. I mean, there's so much authentic stuff on YouTube and there's so much inauthentic stuff, and it's very difficult to tell the difference. And large media organizations like the BBC and the New York Times have created whole digital forensic departments to look at that kind of documentation, the videos on YouTube, and help them decide, right, which ones are we going to point to on our website, which ones are authentic enough. So they're doing things like figuring out the time of day and analyzing the shadows and the direction of light in the videos, because of all the metadata has been erased by YouTube. So they can't authenticate it by the metadata. So that's become a big part of what the traditional news organizations do. So citizen journalism is great, but you have to have the filter as well. So that's why I felt really, that the support for news organizations is critical that the university's support for news organizations is absolutely critical.
Yeah, thank you. I just have one quick final question.
From saving newspapers to saving journalism.
What about funding? You'd say that universities and the government, let's talk specifically about universities. Where would we get the funds to invest?
Well, that's a matter of priorities. There's a lot of funding there. I mean, endowments are measured in the billions now of major universities, not in the millions, not even in the hundreds of millions. So there is a certain amount of wealth there, or funding possibilities, but it's a matter of the priorities of the universities. And that's really one of the biggest problems, is that the priorities of the universities is to a certain extent sports, but to a large extent is to the comfort and self-esteem of undergraduates. And so investing in amenities for undergraduates and that kind of thing is money that the universities are choosing to spend that way. And I think it's time to reevaluate those priorities. I've never been a university president, so I'm very naive about what their challenges are. But it seems to me there's a real need to reallocate resources to other things.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. More things to think about. So we're at the hour-and-a-half mark. I think that's a good time to go ahead and close. I will remind our participants that we will post the URL for the recording for our lecture tonight on the Follett lecture page. And I want to show my deep appreciation to you, Bernie, for your lecture tonight and for your time as Follett Chair. And to all of you participants for joining in on Zoom as a replacement for our face-to-face opportunity for the Follett lecture this year. Cecilia, thank you as well for helping with the questions. And so I think we'll go ahead and close down the meeting. And again, many, many thanks to you, Bernie, for the lecture.
Let me also add my thanks to Kenneth Theisen, who has been my research assistant at Dominican. He's in the graduate program at Dominican, who's an incredible researcher and has really surfaced a lot of the information that you heard tonight. Thank you, everybody. Stay well.
Yeah, thank you all. Good night.